Ivar the Boneless versus Björn Ironside. Two sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Two brothers who should have been allies. Two legends who became enemies. This is the story of the greatest brother rivalry in Viking history. The disabled genius against the mighty warrior. The strategic mastermind against the fearless explorer. The man who conquered England against the man who reached Rome. This is not a story of strangers fighting for power. This is family torn apart by ambition, jealousy, and the impossible shadow of their legendary father. This is the true story of Ivar versus Björn, the brother war that split the Viking world, the rivalry that changed history, the betrayal that nearly destroyed Ragnar's legacy. They were born into legend, sons of the most famous Viking who ever lived. Ragnar Lothbrok's name echoed across Europe, a warrior king whose raids had terrorized Francia and England, whose fame had spread from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. But fame is a heavy burden for children to carry, and Ragnar's sons would spend their lives trying to escape his shadow or prove themselves worthy of his name. Ivar was born broken, his legs twisted and useless, a disability that should have meant death in Viking society where strength and physical prowess determined worth. But Ivar's mother Aslaug, herself a woman of legendary lineage, refused to let her son be exposed to die as was customary for disabled infants. She saw something in Ivar's eyes, an intelligence and determination that transcended his physical limitations. Ragnar, despite initial reluctance, agreed to let the boy live, a decision that would change the course of Viking history. Björn was everything Ivar was not. Born to Lagertha, Ragnar's first wife and a legendary shield maiden in her own right, Björn inherited his mother's warrior spirit and his father's charisma. He was tall, strong, handsome, everything a Viking warrior was supposed to be. Where Ivar struggled to crawl, Björn ran and fought. Where Ivar was mocked for his disability, Björn was admired for his strength. The contrast between the brothers was stark and cruel. From earliest childhood, the dynamic between them was complex, poisonous, and ultimately destructive. Ivar, brilliant but physically helpless, watched his able-bodied brothers train with weapons in the yard, hunt in the forests, fight mock battles, do all the things that defined Viking manhood and earned respect. He felt the sting of every pitying look from warriors who saw a crippled boy and assumed weakness. He heard every whispered comment about the cripple or the boneless one, terms that were meant as description but felt like mockery. He experienced every moment when others assumed he was less, when they spoke over him or around him as if his disability meant his mind didn't work either. This created a burning, consuming rage in Ivar, a rage that he learned to hide behind cold calculation and strategic thinking. He couldn't fight his brothers physically, couldn't prove himself in the training yard, couldn't earn respect through traditional means. So he became brilliant in other ways. He studied tactics and strategy while his brothers played at fighting. He learned to read people, to manipulate, to turn his weakness into others' underestimation of him, which became a weapon. He developed a mind so sharp that it became more dangerous than any sword. But the psychological cost was enormous. Ivar grew up knowing he was different, knowing that in a culture that valued physical prowess above almost everything else, his disability marked him as inferior. Every success his brothers achieved, every praise Ragnar gave them for their fighting skills, every admiring look from women, every respect shown by warriors, felt like a rebuke to Ivar. Each of their triumphs reminded him of what he could never be, what his broken legs had stolen from him. Björn, for his part, seemed to have everything naturally that Ivar had to fight for with desperate cunning. Respect came easily to the tall, strong son of Lagertha and Ragnar. Warriors followed him because they admired his courage and strength, because he looked and acted like what a Viking leader should be. Women were attracted to his physical prowess and confident bearing. Ragnar treated him as a future leader from an early age, taking him on raids as soon as he was old enough, teaching him strategy and warfare in the field, giving him responsibilities that built leadership skills. Björn didn't have to prove himself the way Ivar did. His worth was assumed, accepted as natural, never fundamentally questioned. If he failed at something, it was just a learning experience. If Ivar failed, it confirmed what everyone secretly thought about the cripple. This fundamental difference in how the world treated them poisoned their relationship from the start. But there was a price to being Björn that Ivar perhaps didn't fully appreciate. He lived under constant comparison to Ragnar, with every action measured against his legendary father's achievements. When Björn succeeded, people said, "He's Ragnar's son, of course he's good." When he failed, they said, "He'll never be as great as his father." He was expected to be great simply because of whose son he was, and that expectation was both a gift and a crushing burden. And perhaps most painfully for Björn, he knew that Ragnar had other sons, that his position as eldest and favorite was never entirely secure, especially as Ivar's brilliant mind became impossible to ignore. Ragnar, despite his initial reluctance about Ivar's disability, came to appreciate his son's intelligence. There were moments when Ragnar would ask Ivar's opinion on strategy, would praise his clever thinking, would show the kind of intellectual respect that Björn, focused on physical prowess, had never sought or received. This created a different kind of insecurity in Björn. He was the warrior, the strong one, the traditional Viking hero. But as they grew older, as Ivar's strategic genius became more apparent, Björn must have wondered whether being a great warrior was enough, whether his father truly respected him the way he respected Ivar's mind. This insecurity would drive much of Björn's need to achieve spectacular feats, to sail farther and conquer more dramatically than anyone else, to prove his worth through increasingly ambitious exploits. The brothers had other siblings, Hvitserk, Sigurd, Ubbe, and the dynamics among all of Ragnar's sons created a toxic environment of competition and resentment. But the rivalry between Ivar and Björn was different, deeper, more fundamental. Ivar represented intellect triumphing over physical limitation. Björn represented traditional Viking values of strength and courage. They were opposing philosophies of what made a great Viking, and only one could be proven right. Ragnar's death changed everything. When their father was executed in England by King Ella, thrown into a pit of venomous snakes, Ragnar's sons faced a choice. They could fragment, each pursuing his own ambitions, or they could unite to avenge their father and claim his legacy. Initially, they chose unity, and that unity would make them terrifying. The great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865 was the largest Viking force ever assembled, a war machine that would conquer most of Anglo-Saxon England within a decade. And it was led by Ragnar's sons working together in an alliance that was as impressive as it was fragile. The army numbered in the thousands, drawing warriors from across Scandinavia, all united by the promise of revenge for Ragnar and the wealth of England. Ivar provided the strategy and the political maneuvering that made the conquest possible. He understood that conquering England required more than just winning battles. It required dividing the English kingdoms against each other, making alliances with some Anglo-Saxons against others, ensuring supply lines remained open, keeping the massive army fed and equipped over years of campaigning. Ivar's genius lay in seeing the political and logistical chessboard that his more martial brothers often ignored. Björn provided something equally crucial: martial leadership and inspirational presence that held the army together and motivated warriors to fight. Viking armies were not professional soldiers following orders unquestioningly. They were free men who followed leaders they respected, who fought because they believed in the cause and trusted their commanders. Björn's courage in battle, his willingness to fight at the front rather than commanding from behind, his tall presence that warriors could see and rally to, these were essential to maintaining army morale and cohesion. Together, with their brothers Hvitserk, Ubbe, and Sigurd, they were devastating. Kingdom after kingdom fell before them. In 866, they captured York, one of England's greatest cities. In 867, they defeated and captured King Aella of Northumbria, the man who had killed their father. The execution of Aella was carried out with the blood eagle ritual, one of the most brutal methods of killing in Viking culture, where the victim's ribs were cut from the spine and pulled out to form the shape of wings. It was revenge elevated to art, and it sent a message across England about what happened to those who harmed Ragnar's sons. But even in their moment of triumph over Aella, tensions surfaced. Who should perform the blood eagle? Whose revenge was this? Ivar argued that as the strategic mastermind who had made the conquest possible, he should have the honor. Björn argued that as the warrior who had actually defeated Aella in battle, the right was his. Their brothers had to mediate, and eventually they performed the ritual together, but the argument revealed the underlying competition that would eventually destroy their alliance. As they continued conquering England, Mercia fell in 874, East Anglia in 869, Wessex was nearly overrun. The question of credit and leadership became increasingly problematic. Contemporary English chronicles, written by monks who were hardly sympathetic to the Vikings, nonetheless recognized that the great Heathen Army had two distinct leadership styles. Ivar was described as cruel and cunning, a man who used his mind as a weapon. Björn was described as fierce and bold, a warrior king in the traditional mold. Both were feared, but differently. The warriors in the army began to divide into factions based on which brother they admired more. Some, particularly the younger and more traditional Vikings, gravitated toward Björn's straightforward warrior leadership. They wanted a leader they could follow into battle, whose courage was visible and inspiring. Others, particularly older and more experienced warriors who had seen many battles, appreciated Ivar's strategic brilliance and his ability to win campaigns through maneuver rather than just frontal assault. This factionalizing of the army was dangerous, and both brothers knew it, but neither could resist encouraging their own supporters. Ivar would give choice assignments to his faction, placing them in positions of honor and profit. Björn would do the same with his followers. What had been one army was slowly becoming two armies that happened to be fighting the same enemy, and it was only a matter of time before that arrangement collapsed. The split became inevitable when Björn announced his intention to lead an expedition to the Mediterranean, taking a significant portion of their army and fleet to raid lands that Vikings had barely touched. This wasn't just a raid. It was a multi-year expedition that would take him away from England at a crucial time when their conquests needed to be consolidated and defended. Ivar saw this as abandonment, as Björn putting personal glory ahead of their collective achievement and their father's legacy. They had conquered most of England together, had avenged Ragnar, had established Danish control over vast territories. Now was the time to build, to establish lasting rule, to create kingdoms that would endure. Taking thousands of warriors on an adventure to the Mediterranean would weaken their hold on England, potentially allowing English resistance to regain ground. Björn saw Ivar's opposition as jealousy and control-seeking. Ivar couldn't lead a Mediterranean expedition. His disability made such a long, dangerous voyage impractical. So Ivar was trying to prevent Björn from achieving something Ivar never could. Björn argued that raiding the Mediterranean would bring enormous wealth that could strengthen their position in England, that it would terrify potential English rebels by demonstrating Viking power's reach, that exploring new territories was part of the Viking spirit that Ragnar himself had embodied. Their arguments became legendary among the Vikings, remembered and recorded because of how shocking it was to see Ragnar's sons at each other's throats. Witnesses described Ivar's cold, controlled rage. He didn't shout or storm about, but his words were like ice, methodically destroying Björn's arguments, questioning his brother's judgment and courage. Ivar suggested that Björn was running away from the hard work of governing England because he was better at fighting than thinking, implying that his brother was a simple warrior who couldn't handle the complexity of statecraft. Björn's anger was hot and explosive in contrast. He accused Ivar of being a power-hungry schemer who wanted to rule England alone, who was using brotherhood and their father's legacy as manipulation to keep Björn under control. He called Ivar a cripple who was jealous of men who could sail and fight and explore, who wanted everyone as limited as he was. These were words that could never be taken back. insults that cut to the core of who they were. Their other brothers tried desperately to mediate. Hvitserk, who had always been closest to Ivar, attempted to broker a compromise where Björn would take a smaller force for a shorter expedition. Ubi, who sympathized more with Björn's desire for adventure, suggested that Ivar could govern England while Björn explored, but they would remain allies and partners. But both Ivar and Björn were too proud, too angry, too convinced of their own rightness to accept compromise. Björn departed for the Mediterranean in 859 AD with 62 ships and several thousand warriors. Some estimates suggest as many as 5,000 men left with him, nearly half of the great heathen army's effective strength. This was a devastating blow to Ivar's position in England. Suddenly vulnerable to English counterattacks, Ivar had to scramble to maintain control with reduced forces, had to make new alliances, had to fight battles he might not have faced if the army had remained united. For 3 years, from 859 to 862 AD, Björn was gone. And during that time, he became a legend independent of his brothers and his father. He raided through Moorish Spain, sailed along the coast of North Africa attacking targets that had never seen Vikings, struck Sicily and southern Italy, and most famously attempted to raid Rome itself. The stories of his expedition would be told for generations. The clever ruse where he pretended to be dead to get his warriors inside a fortified city, the incredible treasures captured from Mediterranean civilizations, the exotic lands and peoples encountered. When Björn returned in 862, wealthy beyond imagination, famous throughout the Viking world, he found a very different situation than he had left. Ivar had not just survived without him. Ivar had thrived, had established himself as king in significant parts of England, had made himself indispensable to the Danish position in Britain. Ivar had proven that he didn't need Björn, didn't need anyone, that his mind was sufficient to build and maintain a kingdom. The dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted. Before the Mediterranean expedition, Björn had been the warrior hero and Ivar the strategic advisor, an unequal partnership where Björn's traditional leadership was assumed superior. Now they were equals in a way that made cooperation impossible. Björn had proven himself a great explorer and raider worthy of Ragnar's name. Ivar had proven himself a great king and state builder creating lasting change. Neither could claim clear superiority, and that ambiguity fueled their rivalry rather than resolving it. The final break came over the fundamental question of what they were building and where their future lay. England was largely conquered. The great heathen army had achieved its primary objectives of revenge for Ragnar and establishment of Danish control over significant English territories. But what came next? This question, seemingly simple, revealed irreconcilable differences in vision between the brothers. Ivar wanted to continue building his English kingdom, establishing permanent Danish rule, creating institutions and systems of government that would outlast any individual warrior. He saw England as the future, a place where Vikings could transition from raiders to rulers, where they could build something lasting. His vision was administrative, political, focused on long-term consolidation of power. He imagined himself, despite his disability, as the founder of a dynasty, his descendants ruling England for generations. Björn wanted to return to Scandinavia, to claim their inheritance in their homeland, to rule where their father had ruled rather than as foreigners in a conquered land. He saw England as a conquest, not a home, a place to extract wealth and glory from, but not to settle permanently. His vision was more traditional, focused on raiding and war as continuing activities rather than as means to the end of stable rule. He wanted to be a Viking king in Scandinavia, not a Danish king in England. The argument escalated beyond words into actual preparations for conflict. According to some saga accounts, which admittedly may exaggerate for dramatic effect, Ivar actually plotted to have Björn assassinated. The story goes that Ivar approached trusted warriors with suggestions that Björn was planning to take the army back to Scandinavia by force, that he was secretly negotiating with English forces to betray the Danish position. These were lies, manipulations designed to turn warriors against Björn, to isolate him and make his removal seem justified. Other sources, equally unreliable but equally suggestive, describe Björn gathering his own faction of warriors and preparing to march on Ivar's headquarters, threatening to kill his brother if he didn't release warriors who wanted to return to Scandinavia. The saga describes Björn sharpening his weapons while declaring that if Ivar wouldn't let men leave peacefully, blood would decide the matter, even if that blood was his own brother's. Whether these specific plots were real or saga embellishments created to add drama to the story, what is historically certain is that the brothers came to the brink of actual warfare against each other. Warriors in the army were forced to choose sides, to declare whether they supported Ivar's vision of building an English kingdom or Björn's plan to return to Scandinavia. Families were divided, friendships destroyed. The army that had conquered England together was tearing itself apart from within. The catastrophe was averted by their other brother's intervention, and perhaps more importantly, by the practical recognition that civil war between Ragnar's sons would be disastrous for everyone. Hvitserk, who had remained loyal to Ivar throughout most of the conflicts, nonetheless saw the danger of fratricide and worked desperately to prevent it. Ube, who sympathized with Björn's desire to return to Scandinavia, nonetheless understood that open warfare would destroy everything they had built. Together, these mediating brothers managed to broker a compromise that was really just a formalized separation. Björn would return to Scandinavia with those warriors who wanted to follow him and their share of the English wealth. Ivar would remain in England with his supporters and his kingdom. They would divide their father's legacy geographically, each ruling their own territory, and most importantly, they would stay out of each other's way. It was not reconciliation, but mutual avoidance. Not peace, but an agreement not to fight. Björn returned to Scandinavia and eventually became king of Sweden, ruling from Uppsala, one of the most important Viking centers. He married, had children, built a dynasty. His raids and his Mediterranean expedition became legendary, told and retold in sagas. He died in his bed, a king, wealthy and respected, his life an adventure worthy of his father's name. Ivar remained in England until English resistance finally overwhelmed Danish control in some regions. He may have died in battle around 870 or 873 AD, the sources conflict. Some accounts say he was killed fighting the resurgent English. Others suggest he died of illness or old age. What is certain is that his strategic genius and his establishment of Danish rule in England had lasting consequences. The Danelaw he helped create would exist for generations, fundamentally altering English culture and politics. Their rivalry raises profound questions about what makes greatness. Björn achieved fame through traditional means: exploration, conquest, personal courage. He was the hero of adventure stories, the warrior who sailed to Rome and came back rich and famous. His life was exciting, dramatic, the stuff of legends. Ivar achieved power through non-traditional means: intellect, strategy, political skill. He overcame a disability that should have destroyed him and built a kingdom despite being unable to walk. His achievements were administrative, strategic, less immediately dramatic, but arguably more lasting in their impact. Who was the greater son of Ragnar? The question divided Vikings in their own time and continues to fascinate historians today. Björn's supporters would point to his exploits, his adventures, his embodiment of Viking warrior ideals. Ivar's supporters would point to his kingdom, his lasting political changes, his proof that greatness transcends physical ability. Perhaps the real tragedy is that together they were unstoppable, but their egos and ambitions drove them apart. The great Heathen Army's conquest of England was a collaborative achievement of all Ragnar's sons, but especially of Ivar's strategy and Björn's martial leadership. If they had continued working together, if they had combined Ivar's political genius with Björn's inspirational leadership, they might have established a permanent Viking dynasty ruling all of England and beyond. Instead, their rivalry consumed them. They spent their later years in separate kingdoms, each achieving individual success but never recapturing the glory of their early cooperation. They proved that family bonds, even among sons of a legend, can be destroyed by ambition and pride. They demonstrated that the shadow of a famous father can poison relationships between siblings competing for his legacy. The sources that describe their rivalry, the sagas, the chronicles, the fragmentary historical records, show the human reality behind legendary names. These were not just great warriors and kings. They were brothers who loved and hated each other, who felt jealousy and admiration, who wanted both to support and to surpass each other. Their humanity makes their story compelling across centuries. Modern audiences connect with this story because family rivalry is universal. We all know what it's like to compete with siblings, to feel inadequate compared to a brother or sister who seems to have everything we lack, to struggle with the question of whether we can ever escape a parent's shadow. Ivar and Björn's story, for all its Viking Age setting and medieval warfare, is fundamentally about these timeless human struggles. From the poisonous competition of childhood to the political split that divided them in adulthood, from their brief unity in avenging Ragnar to their permanent separation as rulers of different kingdoms. Ivar and Björn's rivalry shaped the Viking Age and influenced history for generations. They were two of the greatest Vikings who ever lived, and they spent their lives trying to prove which one was greater. Neither definitively won, and perhaps that's the point. Greatness comes in different forms, and comparing them is ultimately meaningless. But they couldn't see that, and their inability to accept each other's different kinds of excellence destroyed what could have been an unstoppable partnership. If you enjoyed this saga of the brother war that split the Viking world, make sure to subscribe to Viking Valhalla for more untold stories of legendary warriors. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another epic tale. Which rivalry should we explore next? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, may your family be loyal and your legacy united. Skål!